It begins with silence, so complete it feels alive. The winter of 1867, in a coal mining town called Coldwater Creek, Pennsylvania. The air is bitter, the streets empty, snow falling in muffled sheets. And then the sound of bare feet against ice. Witnesses would later swear they saw him first at dawn. A boy, no more than 8 years old, standing barefoot in the middle of the frozen street, his skin pale as porcelain, his breath invisible in the cold. He wore no coat, no shoes, no scarf. Yet the frost did not touch him. The townsfolk who approached him felt something even more disturbing. His eyes, too large, too still, never blinked. He didn't speak. He didn't shiver. He only watched. The sheriff took him in, assuming he was a lost child. But when the town's women tried to feed him, he would not eat. When they gave him a bed, he did not sleep. And when they asked his name, the only word he finally gave them was, "Timothy." Later, someone would claim the boy had no pulse. Another swore his reflection in the church's mirror appeared an instant later than it should have. Within a week, the town could no longer agree if he was a miracle or something much worse. The church bells tolled in warning. Doors locked earlier. And still, the boy stood in the snow outside homes at night, unmoving, watching. The record of his arrival was buried in local archives. But the question remains, over a century later. Who was Timothy Caldwell? And what was he doing in Coldwater Creek that winter? Coldwater Creek was a place built on routine. Men worked the mines, women kept the homes, and Sundays belonged to God. But after the boy appeared, nothing was the same. He was placed in the sheriff's home first, then shifted from family to family, as though no one could stand to keep him under their roof for long. The reason was never fully explained, only muttered in half-phrases. He watches, or asterisk, he doesn't close his eyes at night. Asterisk, children refused to play outside when Timothy lingered near. Horses reared at his presence. Dogs barked until their throats gave out. Even the coal miners, men who faced darkness every day, crossed themselves when they saw him. The churches split. One pastor called him a gift from God, proof of a new age of miracles. Another branded him a sign of the devil, a harbinger of punishment for the town's sins. Both sermons ended in hysteria. Parishioners fainting in the pews, women weeping openly. Doctors examined him, but every report contradicted the last. One swore he had no heartbeat. Another said his blood clotted instantly when drawn. A third physician wrote that the boy's eyes seemed to follow him even after he left the room. And yet Timothy never fought back, never cried, never resisted. He simply existed, like a mirror placed inside their lives, reflecting the fear they didn't want to name. By February of 1867, the fear had infected every corner of Coldwater Creek. Families stopped gathering at the tavern. Schools closed early. And at night, shutters slammed shut, though everyone whispered they could still feel him outside, standing in the snow. The boy hadn't harmed anyone. And still, the town was breaking. The name Caldwell was already a scar in Coldwater Creek long before Timothy appeared. The family had once been prosperous farmers on the outskirts of town, but their fortune rotted faster than the crops they tried to grow. In less than 2 generations, the Caldwells became known for tragedy. Stillbirths, mothers dying in childbirth, fathers lost in the mines, infants who lived no longer than a season. Parish records show the Caldwell name more often carved into headstones than written in wedding registries. By 1867, only one Caldwell remained, a widow named Margaret. Some claimed she had prayed desperately for a child, though she was well beyond childbearing years. Others said she never left her cabin, except to sit silently in the back pew of the church. No one could explain why, when the boy first spoke his name, it was hers, Timothy Caldwell. Margaret refused him. She swore before witnesses that the boy was no kin of hers. But the name attached itself to him all the same, passed along by the town until it was indistinguishable from truth. Digging deeper, a pattern emerges. The Caldwells had always been entangled with unexplainable events. A century earlier, one ancestor was tried in Philadelphia for unlawful rites after being caught conducting rituals in the graveyard. Another Caldwell drowned under circumstances described as voluntary, though his body was found with stones sewn into his coat pockets. The family seemed to carry a shadow, a curse that devoured its children before they could grow. Timothy, then, was not a continuation of their bloodline, but a rupture. Where others had died too soon, he lingered unnaturally. Where others faded, he seemed impossible to erase. The Caldwell curse had always ended in silence, but Timothy was silence given form. If Timothy Caldwell was not born of Margaret's body, then where had he come from? The answer emerged decades later, buried in the yellowed pages of an abandoned orphanage's ledger. The orphanage, St. Helena's, had closed its doors long before Timothy appeared in Coldwater Creek. Its walls stood crumbling just beyond the Susquehanna River, windows shattered, roof sagging. During an inventory of church properties in the 1890s, a clerk discovered the ledger tucked away in a locked chest. The book was simple: columns of names, dates of intake, notes on parents lost to disease or war. But midway through the 1866 entries, something strange appeared. Written in careful, deliberate script was a name: Timothy Caldwell. The date beside it was months before Timothy first walked barefoot into town. There were no notes about his parents, no intake explanation, and stranger still, no departure recorded. Children who were adopted, run away, or deceased were always marked. Timothy's line ended blank, as if whoever wrote his name down expected something that never happened. Scholars who later examined the book noted the ink itself looked different, older, darker, as though it had been pressed into the page rather than written by hand. The handwriting didn't match any of the orphanage staff. Some believed it was a clerical mistake, others a prank, but there was one detail no one could explain. Timothy's entry was written in a hand that matched letters preserved from a Caldwell ancestor dead for nearly 80 years. When this discovery reached Coldwater Creek, the story was quietly smothered. The ledger disappeared into diocesan archives. Witnesses were discouraged from speaking, but a rumor lingered that Timothy had not arrived in town at all. He had been entered into existence. After months of unrest, the church decided the boy did not belong among the families of Coldwater Creek. He was placed under the care of St. Mark's Seminary, a gray stone fortress on the hill, where the clergy claimed they would guide him into the light. To the public, this was presented as a blessing. The priest told the townsfolk Timothy was chosen, a vessel of divine mystery, too sacred for common homes. But the private journals of the seminary's rector, later uncovered in fragments, painted another picture. The child is not like us. One entry reads, **, he possesses animation without life. His silence is not innocence but occupation. Something dwells in him, waiting. **, Timothy's behavior in the seminary only deepened suspicion. He did not bow his head in prayer, though he would kneel for hours in perfect stillness, staring at the altar candles as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Monks reported their sleep broken by dreams of children chanting in empty corridors. Others complained of objects vanishing from their cells, rosaries, Bibles, even food, only to find them later neatly arranged at Timothy's bedside. The priests tested him in their own ways. They placed crucifixes in his hands. He neither flinched nor trembled. They read scripture in his presence. He listened without reaction. But when hymns were sung, Timothy's lips sometimes moved, silently, not matching the words, as though echoing another song entirely. And then came the most disturbing discovery of all. During a winter examination, a young seminarian placed his ear against Timothy's chest, searching for a heartbeat. What he heard instead was described as asterisk, a low hum, constant, like the turning of distant wheels. Asterisk. The seminary had promised to make Timothy holy. Instead, it was Timothy who began to make the holy profane. The church could no longer contain its unease. By the spring of 1867, physicians from Philadelphia were summoned, men of science tasked with solving what faith could not. Timothy was removed from chapel life and placed in a locked chamber within the seminary, where he was subjected to a series of examinations. The records that survive are clinical but unnerving. Needles pushed into his skin drew no reaction. His pupils did not contract under sunlight or lamplight. He was left without food for days, yet his body showed no signs of weakness or decay. Even when deprived of water, his lips did not crack. Most disturbing were the accounts of touch. When one doctor attempted to feel Timothy's pulse, he recoiled violently. He claimed the boy's skin was too cold, too smooth, like glass slick with condensation. Another physician insisted he could feel a faint vibration beneath the flesh, a rhythm that pulsed not like blood, but like the slow ticking of a machine. When his silence was tested, the results were stranger still. The doctors would shout, whisper, sing hymns, recite obscenities, but Timothy gave no reply. Yet each man swore he left the chamber with a certainty that the boy had answered him. Somehow, that Timothy's thoughts had pressed into their own without words. One doctor, Dr. Harrow, attempted to break him with violence. He struck the boy across the face with the back of his hand. Witnesses wrote that Timothy neither moved nor blinked. But Harrow staggered, clutching his chest as though his heart had skipped. He left the seminary that night and never returned. The physicians recorded their findings, sealed them, and swore to secrecy. But in private notes passed among colleagues, one phrase reappeared again and again. Asterisk, he is listening. Asterisk, though confined to the seminary, Timothy's presence reached beyond its walls. Families who had once taken him and began to complain of restless nights, of dreams that were not theirs. Mothers woke to hear their own children muttering in their sleep, words and voices that belonged to strangers. Fathers refused to speak aloud of the secrets Timothy had whispered back to them, things they had never confessed to anyone. The testimonies collected years later are chillingly consistent. A widow claimed she heard Timothy's voice in the rafters of her bedroom, repeating her dead husband's last words. A miner swore the boy recited the details of debts he had hidden from his family. One schoolteacher was found weeping on her porch at dawn, after Timothy's whisper from the snow outside had called her by the pet name only her late mother had ever used. The whispers weren't limited to memory. Some seemed to predict. A farmer awoke to Timothy's voice telling him his barn would collapse. By sunset, it had. A young girl claimed Timothy spoke to her the river rising. The next morning, ice broke and swept away 2 homes. The strangest part was that Timothy himself never spoke in daylight. He remained silent, his lips closed, his expression blank. Yet at night, across locked doors and shuttered windows, his voice slid into the minds of Coldwater Creek like smoke, carrying truths no child should have known. By midsummer, no one wanted to admit they had heard him. Some prayed louder at night to drown him out. Others began leaving offerings of bread or milk at the edge of the seminary grounds, as though appeasing something ancient. The boy did not knock on doors anymore. He didn't need to. The first person to touch Timothy, Caldwell, had been the town's midwife, an elderly woman named Clara Wynne. She was called when the sheriff found the boy in the snow, and it was her hands that wrapped him in blankets, her eyes that looked into his unblinking stare. Months later, Clara vanished. Her absence at first caused little alarm. She was known to disappear for days, visiting mothers in neighboring towns. But when a week passed without word, the sheriff broke into her cottage. What he found unsettled even the most hardened men of Coldwater Creek. The small home smelled of wax and ash. Candles, burned to black stubs, littered every surface. On the walls, charcoal drawings covered the plaster. Crude sketches of a boy without a face, repeated over and over, each one surrounded by looping marks that looked less like writing and more like symbols. On the floor, beneath her narrow bed, was a leather-bound journal. The first half was ordinary, lists of births, remedies for fevers, herbal recipes. But as the pages turned, the handwriting grew erratic. Words crowded one another, letters scratched deep into the paper. Asterisk. He is not born, he is written. Asterisk. The final entry was a single sentence, repeated until the ink tore the page. Asterisk. He waits at the door. Asterisk. Clara herself was never found. No body, no trace. Some claimed she drowned in the river. Others whispered she had gone mad and fled. But children swore they saw her candle still burning in the cottage windows long after it was abandoned, flickering against the glass like a signal. The midwife who first welcomed Timothy into town had been swallowed by him, and with her went the last fragile sense of safety Coldwater Creek possessed. By autumn of 1867, the clergy insisted that Timothy should be integrated into ordinary life. They believed structure, discipline, and education might anchor him, might make him less of an enigma, less of a threat. And so he was sent to the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of Coldwater Creek. At first, the children tried to accept him. He sat perfectly still at his desk, slate untouched, eyes fixed not on the teacher but on his classmates. Soon, whispers spread that Timothy never blinked, even when chalk dust fell into his face, that his lips moved in silence, shaping words that belonged to no known language. One November morning, disaster struck. The teacher dismissed the class for recess, leaving Timothy inside. Minutes later, smoke poured from the windows. By the time help arrived, the building was fully engulfed. Most children escaped, but several were trapped inside, their cries echoing against the flames. Witnesses would never forget what they saw. Timothy standing at the threshold, framed by fire, his pale face expressionless. Sparks landed on his skin without burning. His clothes never smoldered. And when a frantic father rushed past him into the inferno, Timothy smiled, just faintly, as if he recognized something inevitable. The schoolhouse collapsed before noon, taking 4 children and the teacher with it. The survivors swore that the blaze had spread too quickly, unnaturally, as though fire had leapt from beam to beam with a will of its own. The official report cited faulty oil lamps, but the town's whispers told another story, that Timothy had not caused the fire, but had called it, that the boy who never shivered in snow had finally revealed the element to which he truly belonged. From that day forward, no child would sit near him again. After the schoolhouse fire, something broke in Coldwater Creek. It wasn't just grief, it was contagion, an illness of the mind that spread faster than influenza, carried not by air or water, but by Timothy's silent presence. Paranoia took root first. Families began to distrust one another, certain their neighbors were conspiring, whispering, hiding sins. Women fainted during Sunday service when Timothy sat in the pews, swearing they felt his gaze inside their chests like fingers pressing against their hearts. Men left the mines early, claiming they heard his voice echoing in the tunnels, though he stood miles away. Then came hysteria. Entire households woke screaming from the same dream, visions of a boy's face, pale and expressionless, emerging from the dark corners of their bedrooms. A seamstress burned her own hands on the stove, insisting she needed to cleanse herself of his touch. The town blacksmith locked himself in his shop and refused to come out, muttering that Timothy was stealing thoughts from his head. The strangest cases were children. Several began to mimic Timothy, standing silently for hours, refusing to eat, their eyes glassy and unblinking. Parents begged the priest to intervene, But the clergy had already grown divided. Some believed Timothy was a holy trial, others that he was a vessel of damnation. Their sermons only deepened the frenzy, fueling a town already fractured by fear. By winter, Coldwater Creek was a place of shuttered windows and barred doors. No one dared speak his name aloud after sundown, as though invoking it would summon him. Yet each family knew the truth, whether they spoke or not. Timothy Caldwell was already in their homes, already in their dreams. The boy had never raised a hand against them, and still he was destroying them from the inside. Fear in Coldwater Creek might have stayed hidden, a local curse whispered only in back rooms, if not for a reporter. In January of 1868, the Philadelphia Inquirer printed a curious article titled, Asterisk, the Caldwell Boy, a Child Science Cannot Explain. Asterisk, it was brief, no more than a column tucked between news of coal strikes and shipping schedules, but it captured everything the town had tried to bury. The boy found in snow, his sleepless nights, his presence in the schoolhouse fire. The article ended with a line that chilled its readers. Asterisk, physicians note the child bears life without pulse, warmth without fire, and silence that yet speaks. Asterisk, copies reached beyond Pennsylvania. Clergymen debated it. Doctors argued in medical circles. Spiritualist societies cited it as proof of their claims. For a moment, Timothy was not just a local terror, but a national curiosity. And then, just as quickly, the article vanished. The next day's edition made no mention. Subscribers who clipped the story reported it missing from later archives. Even bound collections of the Inquirer held only torn pages where the story should have been. Privately, whispers said the church had intervened, demanding the story be killed to protect the faith or to protect the truth. The reporter himself, one Elias Brand, resigned 2 weeks later and disappeared from professional records altogether. Still, fragments survived. Handwritten notes in Brand's journal, discovered in an attic trunk in 1912, describe his last interview in Coldwater Creek. His words are spare but damning. Asterisk, the boy looked at me. I asked his name. He did not answer aloud, yet I heard it clearly inside me. Not Timothy, something older. Asterisk, the article may have been erased, but its echoes refused to stay buried. In 1871, a minor earthquake struck Coldwater Creek. It was little more than a tremor, but it cracked foundations, shifted beams, and unsettled the ancient stone of St. Mark's Seminary. Repair crews sent to stabilize the building uncovered something no one was meant to see. Behind a false wall in the basement lay a narrow stairwell spiraling downward, ending in a sealed iron door. The hinges were rusted, the lock fused by time. When the masons pried it open, they found a chamber lit only by the remnants of blackened candles. Their wax pooled like melted bones across the stone floor. The room reeked of iron and mildew. Along the walls hung chains with padded restraints, sized not for grown men, but for a child. At the center of the floor was a circle scorched into the stone, ringed by chalk symbols half erased yet unmistakably deliberate. The most unsettling detail was what lay in the corner, a pair of shoes, small, worn, unmistakably belonging to a child. The discovery horrified the workers, who fled the site and spread word through the town. Officially, the church denied the chamber's existence. They claimed it was a root cellar, nothing more. But testimonies from those who had seen it told a darker story, that the clergy had not sheltered Timothy but contained him, that they had bound him, restrained him, perhaps even attempted to summon or banish him through rites forbidden even within their faith. The chamber was resealed within a week, buried under new stone, as though hiding it might erase what had been uncovered. But the rumors endured, carried in hushed voices. The priests had built a prison, and Timothy Caldwell had once been kept inside. In 1872, just months after the hidden chamber was sealed, a physician named Dr. Horace Alcott published a slim medical pamphlet that barely saw circulation. It was intended for other doctors, but one copy survived in the archives of a private collector. The pamphlet bore the curious title, On the Subject of the Caldwell Boy and Certain Aberrations of Flesh. Dr. Alcott claimed to have been summoned to Coldwater Creek under the pretense of examining a malnourished child at the seminary. What he described was anything but ordinary. He wrote of a boy whose body seemed resistant to examination. His pupils did not contract in light. His pulse was erratic, sometimes racing, sometimes absent altogether. His skin showed faint marks as though burned from within, branching lines that resembled tree roots or lightning scars. Most disturbing of all was what occurred when Dr. Alcott attempted a simple reflex test with his tuning fork. Instead of a normal vibration, the sound warped unnaturally, deepening to a low, resonant hum that shook the chamber. According to Alcott, the boy's eyes rolled back, and the walls themselves trembled in response. Alcott warned that the child was no medical anomaly, but something entirely opposed to the order of natural science. He urged the clergy to cease their rituals and release the child from torment or risk inviting forces beyond comprehension. The church dismissed his words as blasphemy. The pamphlet was recalled and burned wherever possible. Yet Alcott's surviving copy still stands as one of the most chilling pieces of evidence. A licensed physician, a man of science, had concluded that Timothy Caldwell was not simply sick. He was something the world had no language for. By 1874, the Caldwell case had already become a whispered scandal. The church wished to silence it. The townspeople wanted to forget it. But there was still one obstacle: the paper trail. Early census lists recorded the name Timothy Caldwell, an orphan, age uncertain, taken into the seminary at Coldwater Creek. The county courthouse once held baptismal notations, land deeds tied to the Caldwell farm, even the coroner's reports from his parents' sudden deaths. And then, slowly, one by one, those records began to vanish. A clerk who worked in the courthouse during those years later told his grandson that men in black coats came late at night, demanding access to the archives. They carried church seals but spoke with voices that did not sound like clergy. After their visits, boxes of files would disappear. Pages were torn from bound volumes, leaving jagged scars of paper and glue. When county historians tried to revisit the case in the early 20th century, they found a gap of almost 20 years in the township's official ledgers. Births and deaths were missing. Entire families had been erased from the rolls. It was as if Coldwater Creek itself had been deliberately redacted from history. Even more unsettling, librarians discovered that references to Timothy in private diaries and letters had also begun to vanish. Not destroyed, asterisk vanish. Asterisk ink had faded, leaving ghost impressions where words had once been. The pages looked rubbed out by an unseen hand, as though the name itself rejected permanence. By the turn of the century, Timothy Caldwell had become less a child remembered and more a rumor that history itself refused to hold. And yet, fragments remained, scraps too stubborn or too cursed to be erased. In the fall of 1881, more than a decade after Timothy was officially removed from the seminary records, rumors began to circulate again in Coldwater Creek. Farmers swore they had seen a boy walking the tree line at dusk, thin, pale, barefoot in the frost. They said his head turned too slowly, as if joints resisted the motion, and his eyes, when caught in lantern light, reflected silver. One family reported hearing knocking at their door 3 nights in a row. When they opened it, no one was there. On the 4th night, the father claimed he saw a child's outline press against a glass. Staring inside, the shape vanished when he shouted, leaving frost patterns on the window that matched the skeletal hand. In 1883, a traveling schoolteacher named Harriet Bowes wrote in her journal of seeing a boy alone on the bridge outside town. She called out, thinking he was lost, but when he turned, his face was not a face at all. It was blurred, featureless, as if unfinished. She fainted, and when she awoke, The bridge was empty. There were also darker claims. Hunters spoke of finding deer drained of blood, yet unbroken, lying in neat rows like offerings. A miner swore he awoke in his bunk to find a child crouched at his feet, humming in a pitch that rattled his teeth. Every sighting ended the same way. No proof, no trace, nothing tangible except the trembling voice of the witness. And yet, each testimony aligned on one crucial detail. The boy had not aged. Timothy Caldwell, if it was him, remained exactly as he had been when first taken into the seminary, a child who would not grow, a presence that would not die. By 1885, whispers of Timothy's reappearance had grown too loud to ignore. Livestock were found mutilated on seminary grounds. Parishioners abandoned Sunday Mass, terrified by shadows flitting across the church windows at night. The townsfolk, desperate and divided, sent word to the diocese. Weeks later, men in black cassocks returned to Coldwater Creek. They did not ride openly into town, but arrived in pairs at night, slipping quietly into the old seminary. Residents swore the church bells rang without hands to pull the ropes, tolling at midnight as though announcing something neither holy nor human. The priests carried with them wooden crates bound with iron clasps. Some believed these contained relics, fragments of the true cross, holy water from Rome, bones of saints. Others whispered darker things, that the crates held tools of restraint, chains etched with scripture, and instruments designed not for salvation but for containment. No sermons were preached, no blessings offered. Instead, villagers noticed the priests digging trenches around the seminary, embedding iron stakes into the soil, hammering symbols deep into the earth. Witnesses recalled that Latin chants reverberated long into the night, carried by voices that did not pause for breath. And then the sightings ceased. For 3 years, Coldwater Creek lay unnaturally quiet. Cattle flourished. Children played freely. The fog that clung to the river broke apart. It seemed the clergy had done what was necessary, silenced the boy, or buried him for good. But the silence was not relief. It was pressure, a pause in the storm, the kind that makes every living thing hold its breath. Coldwater Creek had not been delivered. It had been bound. And the boy, whatever he had become, was waiting. In the spring of 1889, a group of children wandered too far into the woods behind the seminary. Chasing after a ball, they stumbled upon a clearing that no one in Coldwater Creek remembered. At its center stood crooked stones, some marked with symbols unrecognizable to them. Others worn so smooth they seemed older than the town itself. What alarmed the children most was not the stones, but the ground. Fresh soil had been overturned in a wide circle, and the earth was blackened as though scorched by fire. They ran home crying of faces in the dirt and bones that breathed. Their parents dismissed it as imagination, until one father returned to clearing and unearthed something that should not have been there. It was a coffin, small, unmarked, bound in chains inscribed with Latin phrases. The wood was scorched but intact, the iron clasps bolted deep into the grain. Inside, the man expected to find remains. Instead, he found only salt packed tight where a body should have been, as though someone had tried to replace flesh with mineral. Other graves lay around it, some shattered, some empty, some filled with stones instead of bones. It became clear that the church had buried more than one child there, or at least attempted to. Word spread quickly, but before villagers could act, the clergy descended once more. The clearing was sealed, stones removed, earth salted again. Those who had seen the chained coffin were warned never to speak of it, but silence did little to erase the image burned into their minds. The church had not buried Timothy Caldwell. They had tried to bury something in his place, something they feared might rise again. In 1892, the river that wound through Coldwater Creek rose without warning. No storm clouds, no weeks of rain, just a sudden violent swelling. The banks collapsed in the night, swallowing fences, barns, and livestock. Families woke to water lapping at their doors, black with silt and reeking of sulfur. The strangest devastation struck the seminary grounds. The newly consecrated trenches the priests had dug years before split open, hissing as if the earth exhaled. Water surged upward, not downward, as though pulled from beneath. Parishioners later swore the flood did not follow the natural slope of the land, but rushed instead toward the burial clearing behind the woods, straight to the chained coffins. Witnesses described seeing the water twist unnaturally, circling the clearing like a whirlpool. Branches bent in the same spiral, pulled toward a center no one could step into. Some claimed the soil itself groaned, releasing bubbles of air that carried whispers when they burst. Others insisted they heard children's voices calling from beneath the flood, muffled yet pleading. The priests forbade anyone from approaching. They stood along the ridge, chanting, raising crucifixes high as though commanding the current. Hours later, the waters began to recede, but they did not return to the river. They simply sank, vanishing into the soil as though absorbed by something deep below. The flood left behind a scar of black mud that killed every crop it touched. Nothing grew there again. Not grass, not weeds, not even moss. Coldwater Creek rebuilt in silence, but no one could explain the event. A flood without rain, a river that rose against gravity, and a clearing that refused to die, no matter how many times the church tried to drown it. By the winter of 1895, the town had grown weary of silence. The seminary stood half abandoned, its windows shuttered, its corridors echoing with the creak of doors that no wind touched. Most assumed Timothy Caldwell, if it ever lived at all, was gone, forgotten, erased. But then came the last sighting. A farmer named Elias North was walking home after dusk, snow crunching beneath his boots, when he noticed a figure ahead on the road. A boy barefoot, wearing only a thin white shirt despite the cold. North called out, fearing the child was lost. The boy stopped but did not turn, his head tilted upward toward the trees, as though listening to something beyond human hearing. When North drew closer, the boy finally turned. His face was pale, almost luminous in the moonlight. The eyes were not eyes at all, but dark hollows that seemed to stretch back infinitely, as though his skull opened into some deeper chamber. North dropped his lantern in shock. The boy did not flinch. He only mouthed words, silent, deliberate, before stepping backward into the woods. The farmer followed only a few paces before freezing in terror. For every step Timothy took backward, the forest seemed to fold inward, trees bending toward him as if pulled into a collapsing center. By the time North gathered courage to move again, the boy was gone. The next morning, only one trace remained. A spiral burned into the snow, carved clean down to the frozen soil, leading to nothing. That was the last recorded sighting of Timothy Caldwell. After that night, no one spoke his name in public again. It was as if he had been absorbed back into the silence that had birthed him. After the final disappearance, Coldwater Creek slowly withered. Families moved away. The seminary was left to rot, its bell tower collapsing in a storm at the turn of the century. By 1920, the town itself was little more than a scattering of abandoned homes, their windows boarded, their gardens overtaken by weeds. The river, once the heart of the settlement, became stagnant, its waters dark and still. What endured was silence, not the peaceful kind, but a heavy silence, as though something had been buried beneath the soil and demanded constant quiet above it. Travelers passing through spoke of an unnatural pressure in the air, a weight that grew heavier the closer one came to the old seminary grounds. Animals refused to graze there. Birds would not land. The church never officially acknowledged what happened in Coldwater Creek. No sermons, no confessions, no records. What few documents survived were scattered across private collections, hidden in locked drawers, or sold at auctions with no mention of their origin. Timothy Caldwell became not just a forgotten child, but a deliberate absence in history, a wound that institution stitched shut with secrecy. And yet, fragments linger. Local legends of a boy who does not age. Whispered warnings about the river that rises without rain. Farmers miles away still swear their fields sour if they till too close to Coldwater's borders. Some say Timothy never left, that silent itself is his body now, stretched across the land, feeding on the absence of words, the erasure of truth. In the end, the legacy of Coldwater Creek is not the boy, nor the church, nor the coffins chained with salt. It is the silence, and the silence has never ended.